We are now at page 7 of the NEFAR suggested purchase and sale agreement. Beginning with line 338, this gives buyers 10 days after the date of acceptance to have inspections done by appropriately licensed persons. Whenever we count days in this contract, the day after the contract is signed and everybody has a copy is day 1. And we count all days. I'll show you later at the end of the contract where we say if the last day of performance, other than the date of acceptance, is a Saturday or Sunday or legal holiday, we go to the next day that's after that. But in this time, the buyer has 10 days after the contract is fully executed and everybody has a copy to do inspections. Now it says appropriately licensed inspectors. As we know, home inspectors are licensed now, mold inspectors are licensed. It says you can have somebody holding a Florida general license to build, so a general contractor. We've been asked before whether an architect is appropriately licensed to do inspections, and the answer is no. Beginning with line 343 through the next few little subparagraphs 1, 2, and 3, we open the buyer's eyes to all of the things we can think of that the buyers ought to inspect for. We're trying to be fair with the buyer and seller. So we list everything they can inspect for. I will tell you that beginning in line 348, in this version, the R3, the revision 3, we added the words verifying the cost and availability of insurance. And also condominium association insurance being satisfactory to lender. We don't want this coming up at the last minute, but be aware, sometimes the association's insurance on condos is not sufficient to satisfy the lender. So we want the buyer to find that out early. Now, beginning with line 352, we're trying to make this as clear as possible. This is an absolute 10-day free look for the buyer. I'm going to repeat that. This is an absolute free 10-day free look for the buyer. It says if buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion that the property is not acceptable, the buyer can terminate. Buyer doesn't have to give any reason. It can be no reason at all. But in order to terminate, they have to do it timely within the inspection period, that's the 10 days, and they have to give a written notice, you'll see in 354, stating that they're terminating. That can be a one-line email from the buyer's realtor to the seller that simply says, buyer is terminating, or buyer is terminating pursuant to this paragraph, or pursuant to the line. We say here in line 356 something brand new as of the R3 revision. Delivery of the NEFAR release of deposit and cancellation of purchase and sale agreement is not sufficient as the written notice. That deposit release just talks about the contract being canceled and how the binder is going to be dispersed. But it's not the statement by the buyer that I'm out. The buyer needs to give a one-line, one-sentence email within the 10 days to the seller, that is the buyer's realtor to the listing agent, saying the buyer's canceling. Now, on the other hand, the next choice beginning in 358, the buyer may not want to cancel, but may want to say, but will you make certain repairs? And you know, NEFAR has a good repair agreement where you can use that or you can choose not to. But it gives buyer and seller 7 days from seller's receipt of that request to enter into a written agreement. Now the words get new. In this R3 version, these are new words beginning with 361. If buyer and seller have not entered into such written agreement within 7 days, then buyer, not buyer or seller, buyer may terminate this agreement by giving written notice of such termination to seller within 3 days after the 7 days, or meaning if the buyer didn't give that notice, be deemed to have accepted the property as is. This is different than it was before, so I want you to read it and reread it carefully. And then it says that something new again in 365, and that's why it's all in bold. Buyer's request for the repairs, replacements, or treatments, or written agreement between buyer and seller as to same does not eliminate buyer's right to terminate at any time within the inspection period. For example, if the buyer had their home inspection within 5 days and they sent a request to the seller to fix the refrigerator, the buyer still has 5 more days to inspect for other things. Maybe the inspection said we ought to get a roofer out there, or a pool inspector, somebody that's a little bit more capable. So we're trying to make it clear. It's not a change, it's making a clarification. The buyer has the full 10-day period to terminate. Going now to the next paragraph, and starting with 372, the buyer needs to pay all of their inspectors, and they need to hold the seller harmless from any damages that if somebody's hurt during the inspections. Then in 378, we say, seller, if the seller has agreed to any repairs, the seller doesn't have to do them until within 10 days after they reached written agreement with the buyer and receipt by seller of written notice of buyer's loan approval. Some sellers will make the improvements anyway. If the place needs a new roof, we know the next buyer is going to find the same thing, seller may do it. But if this particular buyer wanted something and the seller agreed, the seller doesn't have to do that until there's loan approval. That's why we suggest back on the closing date paragraph that you allow 15 days after loan approval for that closing date. And then, of course, 386 gives the buyer to walk through prior to closing. I highly recommend that you do that. Subparagraph B, beginning 388, is really put in there to protect you. It's saying that you're not responsible for the condition or size of the square footage of the property, and those things are between buyer and seller. And 394, if you recommend somebody to them, it might be an inspector, it might be an insurance company, it might be a lawyer, then they are free to select their own providers, and you're not responsible for that. And then we end that page with saying any repairs needed after closing are the buyer's responsibility. We're now ready to go to the top of page 8. Most times possession, I guess, is given to the buyer at closing, but not always. If there's a small binder deposit of only $1,000, I would recommend that the seller not give buyer possession at closing, but I would choose box 401 to give them possession within 2 or 3 days after closing. If the seller is already out of the property, then you'd mark 400, or if there's a very nice binder, you certainly would mark 401. Now, we added some things there. If you look in 401, it says at no rental cost. But we added, or as otherwise set forth in paragraph 17. We realize that sometimes there will be a rental cost, so you'd have to put in there how much. And then it says if neither box is marked in 403, then possession at closing. And then beginning 404, we're saying if there's going to be pre-closing or post-closing possession, then a lawyer needs to prepare a lease. It doesn't matter whether you call it an occupancy agreement, a rental agreement, or a lease. It needs to be prepared by a lawyer. If the lawyer is doing the closing, my guess is that they won't charge for that occupancy agreement. 407 and 408 just says sellers sweep the property clean and give it to the buyer that way at closing. 409 or 410 are to be marked. The seller says there's no parties in possession other than seller, or we added in that line, we're in 409, or that any parties in possession other than seller will vacate the property before closing. This was an R3, revision 3 addition, realizing that there may be a tenant, but that tenant will be out before closing. Once in a while, you'll mark line 411. Sometimes the buyer is buying investment property and is happy to inherit the tenant. And then we'd have to prorate rent and transfer the security deposits and give a copy of the lease to the buyer. The next paragraph, 16, talks about personal property, and the part above the check boxes starting with 418 says, if any of these items are owned by seller, they convey, and we list them: range, oven, cooktop, etc. And then we have the checkbox system. These are additional things that you're going to make the offer that you want these to stay, and you would mark those things. They're normal things, and then a few not so normal, like a built-in generator and a wine cooler, and then there's lines for other. In 432, there are lines to exclude something. I have seen stuff like rose bush by front door. Maybe the seller has a prized rose bush, and they want to take that out because otherwise it says all plants in the ground. Or it might be a family heirloom chandelier in the dining room that's going to be excluded. That would be the place to do that. 17 lists some, but by no means all, of the addenda and riders that are available from NEFAR. Let's take them one at a time. In note, it says in 437, if you mark these, they're part of the contract. So the first one is a seller property disclosure. You may not want to mark that. You may want to get that during the 10 days, but if you mark it, it's part of the contract, and understand that the lender then has a right to see the seller disclosure. There might be some minor things in the seller disclosure that don't upset the buyer, but they might upset the lender. So I'll leave it to you to decide whether you want to mark that. 439, if there's a condominium, you have to use the condo rider. We called it a rider. Everywhere else we could call something an addendum, we did, but the reason we called this a rider is almost funny. The Forms Committee felt it's too hard to say condominium addendum, and we were all so accustomed to calling it the condo rider, so we kept that language. But obviously, if we have a condo sale, you've got to mark that. And same in 440, if you have a homeowners association with any mandatory dues, even $50 a year, if there's any mandatory dues, you've got to mark that and use that. The lead-based paint, we tell you right there, is the house was built before 1978, and that means if the building permit was pulled before 1978, you have to have the lead paint disclosure. In 442, the continued marketing addendum will never be part of the offer. Buyers aren't going to encourage sellers to continue to market it, but that would be a seller might counteroffer by saying, all right, we accept your offer where you have to sell a property, but we want to continue to sell the house, and if we get a better buyer, we can kick you out. It's called the kick-out clause. But again, the buyers don't check that in their offer. 443, I hope you need it. It means you've sold an oceanfront home. It could be a condominium, though. The unit may be 100 yards from the ocean, way up on A1A, but you still need to check that. You know, that's important now. We learned some lessons with Matthew. You've seen the pictures of the homes along Ponte Vedra and south of Ponte Vedra where there's washout, and many of those homes are not going to be able to be rebuilt. There's not enough land that is landward of the coastal setback line. So it's a big problem. It's something that you don't want the buyer to waive. The buyer wants to make that part of the survey, so use that rider. 444 is the dreaded short sale addendum. If you have the short sale, you'll need to use that. 445 is a harmless form. USDA stands for United States Department of Agriculture, and there are some loans available through them. In Duval County, the only area that is rural enough to qualify for a USDA loan is in the town of Baldwin. Plenty of property in Clay, plenty in St. John's, probably all of Putnam County qualifies for USDA. 446, we tell you that is used if and only if, but always if, there's an FHA loan. It warns the buyer that appraisals are not home inspections, and it warns them about radon gas. 447, obviously the buyer is not going to check that. They're not going to ask the seller for a counteroffer, but the seller may counteroffer by marking that and sending it. Now read the next words closely in 447. To accept a counteroffer, buyer and seller must sign both this agreement and the counteroffer addendum. And we use the same language in the counteroffer addendum. You got to sign both. Other would be if there's anything else to attach to that. Now, additional terms and conditions. You don't want to practice law here, but there are many occasions where you would add a few things here. Here are some examples, but I want to warn you, always use a complete sentence and always use contractual language. Don't say, buyer requests that seller repaint the master bedroom prior to closing. You have to use contractual words like will, shall, agree. So you would say, seller agrees to repaint the master bedroom prior to closing. Again, every sentence has to have a noun and a verb. I've seen somebody just type the word appraising in there. That's not a sentence. What you meant to write in is, this agreement is contingent, and you should say at buyer's option, on the property appraising for at least the purchase price. And the reason I say at buyer's option is you don't want the seller to have the only reason to cancel. What if it was a $200,000 transaction and it appraised for $199,900? The buyer may well want it. You don't want to give the seller an out there. Other things to put in there would be contingent on the buyer inheriting money. That's unusual, or settling a personal injury lawsuit, things like that.